Officially, welcome back everybody for the fall kickoff of the first day of autumn. Today, we are so lucky and so grateful for our guest speaker tonight for the Pechakucha talk, the Lehigh Valley JAJAJA member, Kim Andrews. So Kim Andrews is the executive director of the Japan America Society of Greater Philadelphia, JASGP. They're working on their title and branding in a little bit. But she negotiated and executed the merger of JASGP and the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden, so Shofuso by other people who know the area, to form a $1 million budget organization in 2016. And JASGP administers the Shofuso Japanese Cultural Center, oversees the annual Philadelphia Subaru Cherry Blossom Festival, which is one of the largest cherry blossom festivals south or north of Washington, D.C., and leads the U.S.-Japan Business and Public Policy Series and directs the JASGP's additional Japanese arts, business, and cultural education programs. She holds a BA in art history and French from Temple University and a master in arts in preventive conservation from Northumbria University in Newcastle, UK, and a certificate in nonprofit management from our local nonprofit center at LaSalle University. She's a lifelong Philadelphian who was previously a preservation consultant to over 50 cultural heritage organizations. Kim is a founding board member and former president of the North American Japanese Garden Association, and she currently serves on the board of the Business Association of West Parkside. So we are really lucky. We are really lucky to have Kim here and share her story as well as the story of Philadelphia and Japan. And I'm going to let Kim take it away.
Thanks, Miki. I'm so happy to be here. I love the Lehigh Valley. Both my parents were born upstate, as we like to say. My mom was born in Allentown and my dad was born in Scranton. So I know the whole area. I feel like I'm like a full Pennsylvania gal. But I've been in Philadelphia most of my life. So I'm so happy. I'm so happy to be here and talk to everybody. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Nikki. She already told you about me, so I won't bore you with any more details about me. This is Shofuso, Japanese House and Garden. So Shofuso, we're in West Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, kind of a cognitive dissonance when you come into Philadelphia to see this authentic Japanese site, but there's a long history between Japan and Philadelphia. And Shofuso really is the embodiment of that friendship. So we represent Japanese culture in Philadelphia from 1876 to present day. We've been growing and growing. I've been in my position since 2010. And when I started, it was me and one other guy, and then I fired that other guy. And in the interim, we've gone from having 10,000 visitors a year to we should exceed 50,000 visitors this year at Shofuso. Last year, of course, was a very difficult year, but Shofuso, as you can see from that picture, is kind of an indoor-outdoor site. So we've been really fortunate that people have come back to our site to visit us. And we also, it's a beautiful and very peaceful site. So people have really come to get kind of the spiritual experience of being in natural beauty. JSGP, the Japan America Society of Greater Philadelphia, serves over 70,000 people most years, this year accepted, because we do have the Cherry Blossom Festival, which can have up to 15 to 20,000 people that participate in that either on one particular day or over, we have events over a couple of days also. Confusing things, as Miki was explaining, that we the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden, that was the organization that hired me. to manage Shifusho. We acquired the Japan America Society of Greater Philadelphia by merger in 2019. And as she said, our budget increased tremendously too. So I went from a $200,000 budget to, over $1 million last year. So it's been this time of growth. We actually now, after the crazy 2020 with the pandemic, we have a new strategic plan, and our themes are sustainability and best practices. So we're just buckling down, and we're just going to do the best we can. No big expansion. We've had our foot on the gas pedal for too long. As I said, I had 2 full-time employees, me and another guy, and 4 seasonal employees when I started. And now we have 10 full-time employees, and we have 15 seasonal employees right now. But in bigger years, that actually goes up to 25. So it's gone from being really grassroots to trying to manage this much larger organization. So what we do with Shifusho, our organization, we maintain and preserve Shifusho, the Japan America Society of Greater Philadelphia, and certainly me. That's my big focus. My master's is in conservation and preservation, and so for us, we're a historic site. We have a historic house and a historic landscape, and we take that very seriously. The house is owned by the city of Philadelphia, and I'll tell you a little bit about that as we go on. And our private nonprofit operates it on behalf of the city, but Japanese gardens and structures like this require a lot of expense. So at Shifusho, what we do, general admission visitors come through. We have time tickets, so we're selling tickets in advance just to smooth the process of entry. School, camp, adult group tours, Cherry Blossom Festival. We just resumed our public tea demonstrations just last month, and we're so happy. It was really a loss to not have that happening. This is a ski style house, and it's just made of the most beautiful materials. And we really try to keep it alive by having ikebana installed in the house once a week. And we have a very symbiotic relationship with our ikebana practitioners here. And then we work with Ora Senke Philadelphia, again, a very symbiotic relationship. So they conduct tea ceremony demonstrations, and then they also have lessons in the house. So it keeps this beautiful piece of architecture alive, and it makes it clear when visitors come through, like they understand how the site can be used, why is Japanese architecture like this? How do you use it? People can experience themselves. It also, people walk through. This was built as a museum exhibit, so you take your shoes off once, and you walk through, and you see 4 different types of architecture without having to put your shoes back on. And walking through this space, it really, it gives people a sense of like, well, why do you have to take your shoes off in Japan? There's a lot of reasons for it, certainly, but one of them, once you have your shoes off and you step in on hinoki boards, you can feel how smooth they are. Once you step onto tatami, you can feel how delicate it is, but and how comfortable it is. And it gives people a really kind of a visceral experience of how culture and architecture are connected, and by being in a space, they can understand a little bit more about why there are certain aspects and aesthetics from Japanese culture and how they're played out in the house, and how they can experience them themselves. So Shifusho itself, though, it's a museum object. Nikki, could you go to the next slide, please? So Shifusho is actually the 3rd house and the 3rd garden at this location, Japanese house and garden at this location. The first was in 1876 at the Centennial Exposition, the World's Fair that took place in Philadelphia's West Fairmount Park. Japan came out and had a huge exhibition there in 1876. The exposition itself took up a huge swath of the park. It was the first official World's Fair in the United States. It was held at next to the location where Shifusho is today. And then they built another residence to demonstrate Japanese architecture to the world at the World's Fair. And then there were also lots and lots of exhibition objects in the art museum demonstrating Japanese brass and art and textiles and tea implements. This was Japan's first big chance to really, come out on the world stage. The Victoria and Albert Museum bought all kinds of tea implements that they have on exhibit. Some of them are on exhibit today. And the Philadelphia Museum of Art, not surprisingly, also acquired lots and lots of Japanese art objects from the same time period. So for this, what you see here is the bazaar, the store. Shifuso today is located just behind where that is on that picture. And this was a store. There were a lot of you can see there's a lantern in the front, lots of garden decorations. It was to sell stuff. So there were a lot of, in this case, this was where regular people would walk by and buy stuff. So we actually did an archaeological excavation of this site a couple of years ago. And one of the first things we pulled up was this little ceramic monkey head. And it was from a bobblehead, a ceramic bobblehead that had been sold at the exposition at the World's Fair, that was exported from Japan. It was not any fine piece of art. It was the monkey figure from No Theater, and it was a bobblehead. The head would go back and forth. It kind of stuck in the body, and it had a tongue that would go in and out, in and out. So we found this head, and it was really a good illustration of how, you know, the line when any entity at all is appealing to the public. You've got your high arts up here, and then you've got your you know, your tourist memorabilia, the monkey bobblehead that people could buy and pick up for their families to take back to their little town wherever they came from. And another part of this that's really interesting is that obviously these houses, these structures were built by Japanese carpenters. Now, Philadelphia, you know, people consider it a pretty provincial today. It is not. It's a wonderful international city, but it certainly was very provincial in 1876. So Japanese carpenters, about 25 carpenters came from Japan to build these two structures. And, you know, this is one of the things we explored in our archaeological excavation was what was that experience like? So, you know, first you've got these carpenters, they're coming to a whole other country. Very few Japanese had left Japan, and here they are, they're coming to Philadelphia, and they come out to build these buildings. And in Philadelphia, people couldn't believe what they saw. There were hundreds and hundreds of spectators watching these buildings be put up, because Philadelphians, they had never seen Japanese carpenters before. They had never seen Japanese construction techniques or architecture or the clothes they were wearing or the tools they were using. And the police had to set up a perimeter because Philadelphians came out and gawked at these poor carpenters who were just trying to put up these buildings like they were sent from Japan to do. So it was, you know, kind of an early case of, you know, of these poor workers trying to get their work done and just being gawked at. So, and they, of course, were not the diplomats. There were still plenty of diplomats that came from Japan and went and met with all the other countries, and there are exhibitions in the United States diplomats. But that's one thing that really sticks with me is like that experience, that two-way experience of Philadelphians not being able to believe what they see. No one's ever seen anything like this. And then the Japanese workers who have to be have all the eyeballs on them as they're trying to do their work. So the World's Fair kind of set up this kind of interest in Japan and Japanism, and you know, it started right there at Shifuso, which is, you know, Philadelphia. What it did right there, first Japanese garden in North America. Could you go to the next slide, please, Nikki? So after the World's Fair, the bazaar was taken down and sold in pieces and sold to some Philadelphian, and no one really knows what happened to it. And their garden, then it looked kind of like a sales yard on the picture that you saw, but there was more of a garden behind that building. The garden was there and it kind of went fallow. It stayed there. But in Philadelphia, people considered that like the Japanese location, that it maintained in people's imagination you know, that was where the Japanese exhibition was. So around the turn of the century, in Philadelphia, one of our leading wealthy guys purchased a Neomon gate from the St. Louis World's Fair that took place in 1904. And the bazaar was gone. And so it was installed by Philadelphia dignitaries right there in Fairmount Park, just behind where that original bazaar was. So you can see here in this picture, this looks like it's from the 30s based on that car. It was installed, same site. You know, people remember that's where the Japanese, you know, that was the Japanese garden, and a garden was installed. A new garden was installed in 1909 by one of the private Japanese gardeners of one of the Philadelphia wealthy guys. And this became a huge hit in Philadelphia. This is from a postcard. Someone took this picture, and if you look on eBay, there are postcards of the Neomon Gate, and women's hemlines are going up and down as the times change, and the cards are getting bigger and smaller, but people are going there and visiting. There were a lot of art objects in it when it first came to Philadelphia, but you can see it is unguarded in a park. So those art objects were very quickly moved to the Philadelphia Museum of Art for their own protection. This structure, it actually survived into the 50s. A lot of Japanese sites, Japanese structures like this across the country, across the United States, were actually vandalized or destroyed during World War II. And this was fairly remarkable. Philadelphia, with the American Friends Service Committee, was very, it was a center for Japanese Americans that the American Friends Service Committee helped remove from incarceration in the concentration camps. So there were not a huge number. There are still not that many people of Japanese heritage in Philadelphia, but this long history of connection between Japan and Philadelphia was still recognized here on the East Coast. So this made it through the war. Everybody loved it. In 1955, it was actually being restored, and it caught on fire and burned down. Which is terrible. This is a beautiful, again, this is a piece that's, it's an art object in itself, the structure, but that left, you know, this piece of property in the public imagination. It's a Japanese site, and there was a garden and a pond there. So, you know, that kind of left, what's Philadelphia going to do with this? Could you go to the next slide, please, Nikki? So, meanwhile, in Nagoya, Japan, the Museum of Modern Art in New York was putting on a series of an exhibition called House in the Museum Garden. And there were 3 different structures that were built in the late 40s and early 50s to show influences on contemporary American architecture. So in 1948, the first structure was a Gregory Ames mid-century modern structure, like a family house from California. He was a California architect, and that was in what is now the Sculpture Garden at the Museum of Modern Art. Then that was removed, and a Marcel Breuer house was put there. So, you know, Marcel Breuer, he certainly his architecture had influences on contemporary American architecture. So that was there for a year or two. And Arthur Drexler, who was the curator of this exhibition, and he went on to be in charge of the Met, actually, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He worked with John D. Rockefeller, and they got the idea of having a Japanese structure constructed for their exhibition. So John D. Rockefeller, Arthur Drexler went to Nagoya, Japan, and this is the post-war years. They worked with the Japanese government, and they worked with some academics in Japan to have a structure built for the House in the Museum Garden exhibition. So Shofuso was built. It was designed by an architect named Junzo Yoshimura, who also designed the Japan Society building in New York up near the UN. And he was a mid-century modernist, actually. That was his thing. But he was selected to create this very important piece of traditional Japanese architecture that would come to the U.S. And part of the idea was that it would kind of recreate or rekindle the friendly ties between the U.S. and Japan after the war. So the Japanese government actually paid to have this house constructed. Museum of Modern Art had it disassembled and then brought here and reassembled. And you can see in that picture on the right-hand side, which is one of my favorite pictures, because Shofuso sits in a park now, and there it is jammed into Manhattan. But it was a hugely popular exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art. 250,000 people went through it in a year and a half. It was on the cover of House Beautiful, an architectural digest. It created that kind of mid-century enthusiasm for Japanese design. It was a real big part of that. And it also demonstrated how traditional Japanese architecture influenced mid-century modernism, American mid-century modernism. So with indoor-outdoor living, with flexible spaces, susuma, sliding doors, the veranda that you can sit on, the garden as part of your interior, experience. So it's just an incredible incredibly popular exhibit that really captured the public imagination. There were no plans for it after the exhibition was over, though. So in 1955, coincidentally, it was disassembled and put into storage. No one had any plan for it. Again, meanwhile, in Philadelphia, we had a beautiful structure that caught fire and burned down. And so, again, John D. Rockefeller and the fancy Philadelphians, pretty much all the same families, let's be honest, got together and brought Shifuso to Philadelphia. And in 1957 and 1958, Shifuso was installed in West Fairmount Park. Could you go to the next slide, please, Nikki? So there's Shifuso on the left. It's amazing to me that buildings can be moved piece by piece. And when it happens with, more traditional Western architecture, I'm amazed. And with Shifuso, it kind of made more sense to me because you can see so many of the architectural elements and understand how they fit together, or at least you think you understand how they fit together. So you can see in this slide that on the tiny picture on the left, there are all the supporting beams starting to go up and the supporting platforms starting to go up. And there's Shifuso on the right immediately after. It was opened to the public in 1958. This was, again, this is the third house, and another Japanese garden was installed. So this is a Junzo Yoshimoto structure, and our landscape architect was Tansai Sano, who himself, although he created a very unique and special landscape for our location, specific to our location, he worked with a lot of mid-century landscape architecture design in Japan. So these are two, Junzo Yoshimoto and Tansai Sano are two mid-century modernists, essentially, that have been kind of brought back to work in very traditional visual language that they certainly absorbed throughout their early training, but that was not the work that they put out as a general rule. So these are very unusual and special designs that have, they harken back to, Shifuso is based on, the main structure that you see is based on a guest house at Kojo-in in Kyoto, but it's not an exact match. So Junzo Yoshimoto adapted elements from Kojo-in to really show the finest type of architecture in Japan and have it available to, as this gift to the American people. The roof is made of hinoki bark, which is only on the finest temples and imperial structures. And in fact, when we get our roof repaired or restored, we have to request to purchase hinoki bark from the imperial forest. So it's a whole long planning process for us to be able to get bark to repair our roof, which, needless to say, we need to bring craftsmen from Japan to bring that bark over with them and repair the roof. We have close ties still with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the consulate in New York because of these long connections. With everybody keeps tabs on us and makes sure that we're doing the right thing. So Shifuso, it's immediately, people love it, but it is unprotected. There's no fences around it. The entire area is unfenced. The house and garden are unfenced, and Philadelphians start to love it to death. Could you go to the next slide, please, Nikki? So there's three funny time pictures here on the left. So there's some visitors at Shifuso. The wall that you see behind them is outside of Shifuso, but it was not enclosing the entire garden. There's some bikers in some short shorts looking at Shifuso from the outside before we had a fence. And in the very early 60s, that used to be our public relations person when she was in her very early 20s. She came and visited. Most of the people that I know who are older came and visited Shifuso at different points. It was considered, it was a makeout place. My ex mother-in-law's husband said that he would bring girlfriends there to make out. And people, it was unprotected. So people would come and just like, today, if it were unfenced, people are curious. So they step up onto the veranda with their shoes on. They don't understand how to care for the site. And it became very neglected. It became very run down very quickly, honestly. So people were not caring for it properly. The city of Philadelphia owned it. They didn't know what to do about the gardens. You can see it, it's overrun. In that picture on the upper right is from the early mid-60s. Not that much time passed before Shifuso was completely overgrown because Japanese gardens need so much care. And then there were incremental pieces of actual vandalism, not as many as you would think, but in the early 70s, there actually was a large instance of vandalism where interior panels were just completely destroyed, were torn out and destroyed. And so this is about the time Philadelphia is leading up to the bicentennial. The city of Philadelphia, the 70s were pretty rough in Philadelphia. I was a little kid then, and I remember it. But at one point, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs reached out to the city of Philadelphia and our mayor, Frank Rizzo at the time, and said, "What have you done to our house?" And so Philadelphia worked with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Japan donated $1 million and craftsmen to come to Shifuso and restore Shifuso. Philadelphia worked to have the gardens restored and provided staff and became more committed to guarding it properly. We had actually a park rangers at the time. So could you go to the next slide, please, Yuki? Mickey? Oh my God, I'm calling everybody the wrong name. So the Shifuso was restored for the bicentennial, for the 1976 bicentennial restoration. Our mayor, Mayor Rizzo, he wrote a letter to the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying, "We will never let it fall into disrepair again, we promise." And people, needless to say, it started to fall into disrepair real quick, but this whole process had actually brought attention to it. And there started to be, I mean, you can see in that picture there, look at how beautiful and bright the shoji screens are. Everything was brand new. Could you go to the next slide, please, Nikki? So at that time in 1978, kind of this grassroots group formed, which became the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden. This is when things really started to happen. And the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden, they started as just some people. It was a good number of Issei and Nisei Japanese Americans who were interested in caring for Shifuso, and then other non-Japanese heritage people too, who just love Japanese culture or who live nearby. And so there started to be little activities and cleanup days. In the upper left corner there, that image, you can see that's Taiko Sensei. She's very young there, but she actually became our 80-something-year-old tea master until she retired back to Japan 2 years ago. She started making tea. So people started programming it and taking care of it. And in 1982, or the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden formed and incorporated and became a nonprofit. And so ultimately that's what we are today. But that's what changed Shifuso and made Shifuso what it is today. So that group programmed it, conducted Japanese cultural activities, planned Children's Day, had tea ceremony. They repaired the roof, they restored the roof. Later on, when I came around, we did pond restorations and historic landscape restorations. In that bottom picture, you can see that's the archaeological excavation that we did. So you can see that where behind that pickup truck is where Shifuso is. So the two gardens were right across that driveway from each other. When we merged in 2016, Friends of the Japanese House has been an arts and culture organization. We picked up a business corporate aspect, and you can see there's a corporate meeting there, our annual meeting. And then the awesomest thing of all was last year, and that's what that big picture is in the middle, our Shifuso and Modernism exhibition. We had gotten a big grant from Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, and even despite the pandemic, we were able to put on a large-scale exhibition that explored the relationship between or among our architect, Junzo Yoshimura, who is a Japanese architect, Japanese-American designer, George Nakashima, and then there was a European-American couple, Antonin and Noemi Raymond, who worked in Tokyo. They had their studio in Tokyo for many years. So these kind of three entities, Nakashima, Yoshimura, and then the two Raymonds, they worked closely together. They supported each other. They traveled, to visit each other. They worked together, and they really did help create kind of mid-century modernism as the visual language that we see now. So look at that video, and you'll see the documentary about them. But it was a magnificent exhibition. An interesting point that we've just really been exploring is that Shifuso, the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden, was founded by Japanese Americans, a handful of Japanese Americans who were really strongly active in the reparations movement and redress. And so it's one thing we're starting to work on, and that's one of the projects we're working on next year, is how did these 3 or 4 people, they were working so heavily and politically active to find some redress for Japanese American citizens who have been imprisoned, and they were also concerned about Shifuso and helped found Shifuso's cultural organization. So, you know, we want to talk more about that and explore that link. How does Shifuso fit into that? It's you know, we've always looked at ourselves as a cultural organization, but there's this other piece of why our Friends organization existed, and you know, what did Marion Warren Watanabe intend? What did Grace and Hiroshi Uehara, what were they thinking at the time? So that's work that we're doing in the next year or so to really explore that. Could you go to the next slide, please? And so there's Shifuso today. So today we are a beautiful historic site. Lots of people come through on busy days. More people are there. On slower days, which is when I prefer to be there, it's quieter and you can sit and really enjoy the site. It's small, 1.2 acres, but we have 3 different types of gardens: a hill and pond garden, a tea garden, and a courtyard garden. And there are lots of quiet little tucked away places even in our small site. So we now have timed ticket sales, so people need to purchase tickets, not necessarily in advance, that's recommended, but if you show up, you can buy tickets for the times that are available, as long as it's not too crowded. We received a Reimagining Recovery grant from the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, and that's actually the funding our exploration around our Japanese American heritage. We've always looked at ourselves like, this is a Japanese site, but these Japanese Americans, they were the folks that founded it. How does this all fit in? And we're also working to better engage with the neighborhood that we're in, which is a primarily African American neighborhood right next to Shifuso. And you know, there are some folks in our neighborhood are very familiar with Shifuso, but many are not. And there are physical barriers that have been put up over the years, as well as, you know, how do we welcome those folks into Shifuso? So that's what we're working on with that grant. What's coming up next is we have some bus tours. We have a bus tour to New Hope, again, part of exploring that Nakashima Raymond mid-century modernism theme in the exhibition we had last year. So that's we're doing that, and there's a bento box lunch involved with that, always important. And then going up to the Hudson Valley to Kaiket and to visit the house of James Rose and garden of James Rose, who also practiced in Japan. He's an architect and designer. So those are our big programming things that are coming up. And you know, my master's degree is in preservation, so what we're working on that's really important to me, we're going to get our tatami mats recovered this winter, so that's exciting. I have a grant that has been waiting for us to take action on that, so that's going to be happening. Our mairado, not the amado, the wooden doors on the outside of the house. The paper on the inside is all going to be recovered and conserved. And that's another big project that we've been waiting on, that was paid for by that Pew grant also. But all the doors need to leave the house, so we have to wait till Shifuso was closed for a while. And then we're going to be doing a landscape restoration, continuing that work to really get back to that 1957 plan and really nail our historic landscape. And then we are actually reimagining that Cherry Blossom Festival that we put on every year. You know, it's been curtailed over the past 2 years because of the pandemic. And we don't expect to go back to the same format of kind of like a giant ticketed, you know, 15,000 person event. So we're reimagining how we can engage our neighborhood better, how we can offer a better experience for cherry blossom viewing. You know, in Japan, you don't pay $20 for a ticket to go into where there's some cherry trees. We're going to have a picnicking environment and have a longer period of time where we bring people in, and we have some performers who are still going to perform, but we're reimagining it because it kind of grew into its own behemoth that wasn't necessarily representing Japanese culture as we wanted to represent it, and it wasn't representing our organization as we wanted to. So Pew gave us money so we can kind of rethink how we do that. So, that's where we are. It's a beautiful fall. Today's the first day of fall. It's my favorite season. Shifuso colors change, and I hope that all of you, if you come to Philadelphia, you get a chance to come and visit us. And if not, watch that documentary about Shifuso and modernism and just learn a little bit about how the Philadelphia area was the center of some important stuff mid-century.
Bravo, bravo. Wow, that was so amazing. Thank you so much, Kim. I feel like I was part of an art history class. It's great. So thank you so much. We can't be we're so lucky to have you, and just really, really, you're in our backyard, and I think with your knowledge and expertise, and we definitely would love for you to come visit us in our little Bethlehem Japanese garden of serenity.
Well, I'm going to come up. I'll bring Sandy, our head gardener. We have plans to come up and get a tour of your garden.
Awesome. Yeah. No, we're really looking forward to that. Yeah. Sorry, Patrick. You're about to chime in. We're going to officially close out of this recording session and transition to our Q&A for about 12 minutes for the rest of the hour. Sound good? Okay, great.